So we don't go in talking about sectarianism or the incident that might have happened. We talk about things in a very broad sense. We talk about Northern Ireland and how this place works and how we interact with each other. And we out this notion of politeness, avoidance, and denial very quickly.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist, with me, Josh Hamilton. Mel Corry from Trademark Belfast was my guest on today's show. Mel is a self-described retired hellraiser, banjo player, and communist. His work with Trademark is focused on going into workplaces and confronting our Northern Irish habit of employing a trifecta of politeness, avoidance, and denial to stop us confronting our sectarian past, the remnants of it that still exist within our society, and how we can improve those discussions and our relationships by actually discussing the issues that remain underlying in Northern Ireland today. I had a lot of fun exploring these issues with Mel, and I hope you'll enjoy our chat. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list, and don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. So, here's Mel Corry. So, Mel, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for agreeing to chat to me.
Well, it's really nice to be asked, and it's lovely to be with you this morning, Josh.
So, you're a part of Trademark Belfast. What is your official position in the movement, organisation? How do you describe yourselves?
Well, I've been working for Trademark since 2006. The organisation was established in 2001, and currently my position is co-director. It sounds very grand, but in an organisation of 4 people, it doesn't really mean an awful lot. It's a technical term more than anything else. We're an organisation that is essentially born out of anti-sectarian work that was at one time very, very sharp and difficult work here in Northern Ireland, and as opposed to a certain degree, it's changed, but sectarianism still very much with us. So whilst our work is much broader than anti-sectarianism now, we still see ourselves rooted in that anti-sectarian world that we were born out of. We have a very strong link to the trade union movement. We're sort of an official unit within the Irish Congress of Trade Unions that deals with issues around conflict in the workplace. That's not terms and conditions of employment related. So issues around conflict, human rights, equality, all the stuff that's difficult, that quite possibly trade union officials mightn't have the skills or experience to deal with, usually gets passed over to us, usually when the proverbial has hit the fan as well, and it's very difficult. But that's our sort of roots anyway.
So how did you get involved?
Well, I'm a former textile worker. I worked in a factory here. I was a senior shop steward in a factory in Lurgan, County Armagh, up until it closed in 1999. And I then set about doing some voluntary work for my union, which at that time was Transport and General Workers Union, and doing some voluntary organising work. At that time, I was also involved in the union's education department as a tutor, so teaching other shop stewards basic shop steward skills, advanced skills, health and safety, all that sort of stuff. And that became it turned into a sort of a professional shift for me, because a lot of the trade union education programs started to be delivered through further education colleges. So I worked through various colleges over the years, I also developed an interest in anti-sectarian work, having seen Trademark's predecessor, Counteract, which was established in 1990, and did some really groundbreaking work, particularly in workplaces. And I used to bring my old friend Joe Law, who was a founding member of Trademark, in when he worked for Counteract to alert shop stewards to the dangers of sectarianism in the workplace. So I seen how it was done, and I developed a sort of a passion for that. And I started then to work as a sort of an associate with Trademark when they had a couple of big contracts, and I've been there ever since, really.
Okay. So when you say you're doing anti-sectarian work or human rights work, like, could you give us an example of like the kind of case you would deal with? Like, what sort of thing would they pass over to you?
Okay, well, I suppose there are a number of high-profile cases that we were involved in over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Sectarianism, very much in the north here, has been characterised as we get by with each other here through a process of politeness, avoidance, and denial. We're too polite to ask each other what religion we are or what political parties we vote for. And we avoid talking about the troubles, avoid talking about what makes us different. And then when the subject does come up, we deny there's any problem. Everybody gets on great. Trademark and Counteract before it, our niche was breaking through that politeness, avoidance, and denial, saying we have got problems here, let's sort them out. Going right back to, I suppose, there were issues in textile factories in the northwest. All of these factories, interestingly enough, are all gone. The ones that I'm going to talk about. There was a Desmond's factory up in New Buildings outside Derry, where the workforce was quite mixed, and a number of people came into work one day wearing black ribbons in their lapel, and started to go about their work. And before the first break, there was an outcry on the shop floor because other people reacted to that, those black ribbons. The company didn't know how to deal with it. The union didn't know how to deal with it. There was a walkout of unionist workers. And then the resolution that they came to was that the workers would take off the symbols. And as they were, the unionist workers were walking back into the workplace, they met the nationalists on the way out because they were reacting to the fact that these people weren't allowed to give an expression of solidarity to what was actually an anniversary of Bloody Sunday. Mm-hmm. So in the 90s, all of those issues were still quite sharp. So Counteract was involved in that kind of mediation of how do we deal with all of these issues, and it's done in the workplace. And then there were a whole series of things. There was an issue in Moygashel with the flag up a pole, and the flag would come up, the workers would go back into work, the company would introduce a new policy, flag would come down, workers would walk out, and it was just ongoing. Those kind of things used to happen on a daily basis here. And then we have always argued that sectarianism is an institutional problem in the north, in that organizations are infected with the consequences of the conflict and all the rest. And that came home to roost when there was a major dispute in the Northern Ireland Ambulance Service over a picture on a wall of victims of the Enniskillen bombing, which happened, and the Northern Ireland Ambulance Service decided to take down the pictures, and the local people reacted to that. Not getting into all the detail of all of that, but it started in Enniskillen and then it spread right across the whole of the ambulance service. So the ambulance service dealt with it in a very progressive way, and through the various unions, Trademark were brought in. We spent, it was a period of years, maybe 3 years, training all ambulance personnel on policies, procedures, the right way to deal with these things, but also providing a space to talk about the issues that make us different. So we would have very, very difficult conversations that broke through that politeness, avoidance, and denial. And that's always been our style. And thankfully, over the last number of years, incidents like that have become less and less, but only as late as 2019. I was in a company resolving or helping to resolve a dispute that had the potential to be as big as anything that we had seen previously. Another issue that's very public was an issue in Asda supermarkets. I don't know if you remember that one, Josh.
I don't, just not off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's a good while ago now. But a guy made a remark to a lorry driver coming in to make deliveries in the Show Road. Okay. The Show Road in Belfast, and their Asda shop there. And the guy didn't know what he didn't know whether this man was joking, whether he was trying to intimidate him or something like that. Okay. And he reported the incident to the management. The management dismissed the person on the spot. And the workers walked out of the store in solidarity with the man who had just been dismissed. The allegation was that the remark made was a sectarian remark. So that was okay. The union came along, and of course, if you're a union official of any experience or skill, you would be able to say, well, you can't dismiss somebody for something that you haven't investigated. Man wasn't suspended. He wasn't afforded the opportunity for defending himself or to have representation. Therefore, the dismissal is automatically unfair. The guy was reinstated. The workers came back into work. But before the end of the day, right across Belfast in the nationalist part of town, workers had heard about it and they were saying, what's the union doing defending someone who's accused of sectarianism? There was another dispute over that. So that was a dispute that resulted in Trademark being involved in a project that trained over a period of 3 or 4 years, 4,000 of Asda's staff. It was very high profile work, very difficult. We did night shifts, weekends. We covered every Asda store that was located in Northern Ireland at the time. It formed the basis for a major piece of research that we did on sectarianism in the workplace, which is bubbling under the surface always in this place.
Okay, I want to get to the research in a little bit, but first I want to talk about how you get people to come in and discuss these difficult topics. Like, one of the things that I think people could make a lot of accusations about our sort of modern culture is that we are in ways unwilling to confront difficult topics, especially ones that mention like an uncomfortable part of our past. Like for my generation, that we don't always maybe appreciate how difficult that might be to confront like some of the real horrors that people had to deal with on a daily basis, especially in Northern Ireland, because to us it's almost like a joke. Like it's just something we all laugh about, and I guess it can be difficult to sometimes understand how difficult it can be for older people who had to live through the troubles to then essentially, like, I think the policy that I always sort of hoped might work in Northern Ireland was to say, okay, we have to try and forgive each other, but we can't forget what happened. But even that like idea of being able to forgive people for a lot of maybe of that generation that lived through the troubles is a difficult thing to start to even accept the idea of forgiving someone who was seen as your mortal enemy maybe for 20 years. Like, how do you get people to come in and have those dialogues? Like, where do you start with that?
It's very difficult. It's a very difficult balancing act. And no one, and even in all the companies that I have worked in, where people, we've had groups of 15, 20 people in a group talking about these issues, released from their work. So you're going upstairs into the boardroom for this class. It's going to last 3 hours. No one volunteers for that. No one. I've always asked how many people have volunteered to be at this session this morning, and we spend the first 10 or 15 minutes just exploding that politeness, avoidance, and denial by saying, don't be worrying about it. We're all, I'm no less sectarian than anyone else here. I was born into a community. I was raised in that community. I learned how the world worked from the TV, from my friends, from my parents, family, from school. So I'm no different to anybody else. And you build up over a period, and it has to be done very, very quickly, of course, in those circumstances. Empathy with people, and a bit of trust. And being a trade unionist and being able to say that you come from the trade union, that you're not there actually to necessarily to perform a service for the company, that you're here to mend relationships or do something positive, is also helpful as well.
So you're coming in and you're coming in and, for example, saying to people that this is about you, about the worker, and this is about making the workplace better for you. This is not about us doing something for the company itself.
Yes, if I go back to the Asda incident, the guy who was involved, the man who was involved in that incident, who instigated the whole dispute, we insisted that he would be in the first session. We weren't going to refer to him by name or anything like that. We thought it was important that he would be in the session. We also insist that when we're engaged by a company, that we start with the boardroom and we work our way down through the shop floor. It's important for people to understand that this is a societal problem that's not simply related to working class people. So it's not a case of a company management bringing us in saying, please go and sort out our workers. The management have to go through it first. We also recommend that the management and the trade unionists, whether it's one union or multiple unions, all take part in that initial discussion. So whenever we did the first session with Asda and the guy who was involved in the incident, he just put his hand up. He said, "This is about me, isn't it?" And we were saying, "Well, look, it's there was an incident that precipitated this action, but don't be worrying about it. Calm down. You're not going to be referred to in any sense. We're going to have what may be a difficult conversation, but we're going to handle it in a way that nobody's going to leave this room feeling that they've been singled out or intimidated or threatened in any way." So I think when you can do that in those set of circumstances, it's pretty standard from that going forward.
So when you go in and you say, okay, we're going to perform this training, like what does the training encompass? Like what are you training people to do?
Well, I suppose, if you look at it like that, we're asking people really to consider their workmates, and to consider the fact that how society here operates. That whilst and when you go into a room where legislation has been in place since the 1970s, mid 1970s, which says whatever you do not talk about the war. So you can't have political or religious symbolism in the workplace. And of course, the Northern Ireland workplace used to be characterised by being Protestant factories and Catholic factories, and the symbolism within those walls would sort of indicate what type of workplace that you're in. That was all outlawed in the 1970s. So we talk about that. We say we've got neutral and harmonious working environments here, but we had to introduce legislation to create that. Now, why was that? Where did sectarianism come from, and how does it affect us? And how does it affect our relationships? And the fact that we're all able to sit in I suppose the Fair Employment Acts of 76 and 89 were very, very successful in the sense that workplace discrimination and uh, incidents of intimidation and harassment are nothing like what they were at that particular time. And workplaces are largely much more integrated than they were.
Mm.
So it was a successful piece of legislation. So we don't go in talking about sectarianism or the incident that might have happened. We talk about things in a very broad sense. We talk about Northern Ireland and how this place works and how we interact with each other. And we out this notion of politeness, avoidance, and denial very quickly. So, asking people if you met a stranger in a pub, how would the conversation go? If you met somebody standing at a bus stop, and they said hello to you, and what would be the first question, you know, and you probably know this yourself. You're a lot younger than me, but if you meet a stranger in a pub, how does the conversation go? Once they've asked your name.
Hmm. It's normally where you're from.
Yeah, where you're from. If they don't get it from where you're from, they'll go to the next question, which is, what school did you go to?
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's much more subtle than that. Somebody would come up and say, and I've had it with me hundreds of times, standing in a pub and somebody coming up and saying, I recognize your face. I think I know you. What's your name? And then when they don't get it from your name, no, no. Do you live around here? All of those questions, and when you recognize that that's how we operate here, and I suppose there was a time when that kind of approach might have been sinister and dangerous. We found ways of negotiating our lives through very, very difficult circumstances. That might be hard for people of a certain generation to understand, but that's the way it was um, right up until the 1990s. You had to have a mechanism for finding out if I'm safe in this environment. Am I okay among the people that I'm surrounded by? You know, and we have managed to get away with that, but that residue of politeness, avoidance, and denial is still there.
Hmm.
This was a reticence among people to talk about the issues that still divide us, which I suppose I'm hopeful that it's breaking down with the new generation. Um, but certainly, our view is that if we don't talk about it and we don't find safe spaces to talk about it, then we run the risk of creating a new generation of people infected with the legacy of that conflict. It
Hmm.
might not necessarily be sectarianism, the way we knew it in the 70s and 80s, but it'll be some other form of it.
So, do you think that you're saying about, just for clarification, but maybe people who don't quite get what we're talking about, that you're saying that from the 60s and 70s, because of the way our society was divided, that all of your initial questions, however conscious, it was maybe a lot more conscious and perhaps even sinister, like you said back in the day, where people would be saying, okay, so what's your name, and then they would try to guess from that, are you Protestant, are you Catholic, like how much does your name
Yeah,
give it away? Then it would be, okay, so where are you from? Maybe you say somewhere that's not typically like Protestant or Catholic, and then it's like, oh, so where did you go to school? And that's the sort of question, that's the reason for that line of questioning. Do you think that's still in the back of people's heads, like unconsciously in Northern Ireland amongst young people? Because I don't know, I guess, like for me, I would ask those questions, but in my head, that's not I'm not seeking to discover whether they're Protestant or Catholic. I just kind of want to know where they're from as a basis for a conversation. So do you think that
yeah.
that's still like implicitly what we're looking for when we ask those questions, or maybe not? I don't know.
I think in the last few years when I've been doing this with people and we pointed out, there's always a bit of laughter in the room when you point out politeness, avoidance, and denial. It's almost like, when somebody tells a really obvious joke and you say, "Ah, yeah, yeah, that's exactly how we get on," because people will say, he's right in that sense. I don't think there's as many people have it in their head now when they have those conversations, that they're trying to find out anything. The residue really there is a sort of a cultural uh, thing that we engage in, which that's just the way conversation. That's the way casual conversation goes in this place. You might do that because you've seen other people doing the same thing. You're not necessarily having to, or you're not. Most people are not really interested in what religion other people are, because organized religion in itself is in decline, and a lot of people don't really care about that over the last number of years. But the even when people say I don't care what people's political opinions are or their religion or anything like that, when then it moves us on to a different place, because then I can stop being funny about the whole thing and say, well, okay, let's take it that we're all nice, liberal, well-meaning people, but why do we choose to live separately? Why do we choose to live among our own? Why do we choose to send our children to separate schools? Why do we read different newspapers? Why do we play different sports? All of that sort of stuff. It allows us to tease that out. And that's the purpose of it.
I mean, I guess,
which is what we do.
Yeah,
it's what we do here, isn't it?
Yeah.
In Northern Ireland, we still are a very segregated society. And even well-meaning people, even myself included, we all make decisions about our children, our children's education. Now, I could be very sort of, blasé about the whole thing and just say, well, I sent my kids to the nearest local school. But I'm not necessarily I'm not necessarily sure if I would be being honest just to say that. You know what I mean? That there might have been other reasons why. Well, there would have been a conscious reason why I didn't send them to an integrated school, because there wasn't any about at the time.
Yeah. I mean, I guess for me, I was actually kind of lucky in that I lived in England for about 6 years, like from during my primary school years, just because of my parents had moved there for work and stuff, and then I moved back, and then I guess I went to Sullivan in Hollywood, and I like the first few years, I remember kind of getting the Catholic Protestant jokes or just dynamic, but because I hadn't been bathed in it for like 6 years, I hadn't just grown up around that kind of discussion. It took me a few years before I even understood that there was people who actually cared about like the difference in religion, because it wasn't really something that was brought up that much. Probably for the better in just amongst like the people I was at school with, or the groups I was with, or the teachers I had, or I don't know what exactly it was, but I remember noticing just occasionally and like being intrigued that was still something that people talked about. Like it was almost shocking to me that I was like, hang on, wait, like people actually care? It was a weird one. But
well, you see, being Josh from Hollywood and going to Sullivan tells me an awful lot about you.
Yeah.
Without me having to ask any questions, And I've told you that I'm Mel from Lurgan, and does that give anything away to you about me?
I mean, maybe, but I guess I wouldn't be. Again, like it's one of those things that it doesn't quite mean as much to me. I think maybe in just because, like I said, where I was from, like religion when I was growing up just wasn't talked about, wasn't something we discussed. Like it was only when I became like old enough to understand the conflict and what was going on that I started to notice that was a part of society. I mean, I guess like saying you're from Lurgan, I mean, I could make some guesses, but I don't like to assume, especially not these days.
There, you see, you're being very polite, and you're avoiding talking about the problem, and you're denying that there is a problem because you're a lot younger than me, and it's not an issue for your generation. But I'm sure there's something in the back of your head that's wondering, I wonder is Mel Catholic or Protestant?
Maybe there is.
It's something I do all the time. But I'm lucky in the sense that my name is Mel Corry, it doesn't give an awful lot away.
Mm,
And I can see in people's heads when I'm interacting with a group that I'm talking about all of these things, but they don't know which side of the fence I'm coming from.
mm,
And I let it go and I let it go. And then I would say to people, by the way, has anybody worked out, whether I'm proud or fenian, and go around the room and everybody will have a different view on it. Well, they're from Lurgan. Well, what does that mean? It's full of mad people in Lurgan. They're all dissidents. What part of Lurgan do you come from? Well, I come from the north part. It doesn't give much away. So you toy with people. And then eventually I say to people, listen, I was brought up in a nationalist household. I was Catholic. I went to Catholic school. I don't subscribe to any religion as an adult. But that's not to say I don't have cultural residue from my upbringing and all of that sort of stuff. As I say, I was, brought up and conditioned to be sectarian, possibly racist, certainly homophobic, and I work into all of those issues every day of the week, and that's a way of breaking through to people, and say, okay, well, this lad is just the same as me because I'm just trying to do the same stuff.
I mean, I do enjoy how you use the politeness, avoidance, denial sort of strategy, or like to try to confront that attitude. And there's almost like a complete antithesis. Maybe you can correct me. Maybe you don't think this is the case, but to me, it feels like a complete antithesis to the kind of unconscious bias training that goes on in some places in America quite a lot, and sort of in the mainland UK more and more, where people are being tested for for their unconscious bias, but without really much there's not very much literature at all that proves that does anything, like that it improves the situation at all. Whereas I feel like you're kind of just going in there, and instead of trying to like dance around the issue, you're just going in there with a sledgehammer and just being like, yep, we're going to talk about this, like just sort of smashing through people's, maybe, I don't know. You use the word safe space, but in a way you're creating the very antithesis of that.
Well, in our discussions, in a 3-hour discussion in a workplace workshop, we would discuss everything from sectarianism through homophobia, racism, ableism and disableism, and domestic violence. We cover the whole gamut, and no one has ever got up and walked out in the middle of one of my sessions or of any of our sessions. We've always been able to have people going out saying, I was challenged by that. I really enjoyed that. And companies have come back, and universally, a lot of the companies that we've worked with endorse the work that we do, and it's helped them deal with the problem. And for years, I mean, we've stuck to that sort of anti-sectarian moniker. When other people in the community relations arena were saying that's a bit confrontational, would you not soften that? Could you not talk about good relations and community relations, and it would open up more doors for you? And we were saying, yeah, but it's dancing around the problem. It's not confronting the issues, and it's letting other people off the hook. It's letting institutions off the hook. It's not dealing with structural and socio economic issues that are compounded by the issues of sectarianism. And I think that we have been vindicated over a period of years, particularly when you see, I suppose, the debate that's going on around Black Lives Matter and the outcry over George Floyd's murder, and the number of Black people that have been coming on saying, why are white people surprised by this? We've been, whilst they've been caught in this sort of cultural diversity versus anti-racism mire for years and years, and I suppose a lot of that comes from the American experience as well. And I'm hoping that what's happening with Black Lives Matter and the shift towards confronting racism and an acceptance among institutions that racism is a problem, is that our work being anti-sectarian is being vindicated. If that makes sense. I know it was a bit of a ramble there, Josh.
No, that makes sense. Like, I mean, I find that, like, maybe not COVID specifically, but like this year has kind of brought into quite clear clarity for me. It's funny watching different societies divide themselves over COVID based on like the divisions that are in that society. Like, for example, in America and in the mainland UK, at least anyway, there was a lot of focus on how people from minority backgrounds were being worse affected by COVID. And here we managed to turn it into like how, or not even we, but the DUP and Edwin Poots managed to turn it into, you know, all the Catholics, they're the problem with COVID. And then, you know, we like different societies have managed to make it, and a lot of different people have managed to make this whole thing about the divisions that were already there in society. I found there was some people talking about how women had been worse affected by COVID, and I kept looking at it and being like, wow, this is really kind of bringing into sharp clarity the fact that we can use our existing sort of like fault lines to get mad at each other over anything. It doesn't. They don't have to be like specifically related to it. But the anti-sectarian work you're doing is definitely not far removed at all from the stuff that people are trying to get you to confront with the Black Lives Matter movement. Like they're trying to get people to talk about the history of institutional racism in Britain, in the way they define it. And in a sense, I get the feeling that you're trying to do the same with sectarianism. Which I actually wanted to ask, like, when you mentioned early on institutional sectarianism, do you think, like, how would you define that? And like, can you give us an example of that? Just because perhaps it's a little bit different to the way people have explained institutional racism to me in terms of its definition.
Well, I suppose that since the foundation of the northern state, which is coming up on 100 years. The workplace was always a battleground in terms of who got the best job, who got jobs, you know, whether the best jobs or not. But certainly there was a section of the Protestant Unionist people in the north that were guaranteed all the plum jobs, and the civil service would have been the same, and all the jobs in the emergent health service that came out of the 1945 welfare compromise. And you know that one of the core grievances of the civil rights movement was access to employment for Catholics. And there were people that still to this day believe that it wasn't an issue, that there was no problem. We had to engage in a 10-year campaign since the start of the civil rights movement to 1976 to introduce the first Fair Employment Act, which outlawed religious discrimination in Northern Ireland workplaces. Because up until that point, you could decide that you were giving a job to a Protestant or over a Catholic with the same qualifications. Now, it took, and just because you introduced legislation in 1976, it doesn't mean that you've dealt with the problem in 1977. That legislation had to be updated in 1989 to take into account the private sector, which wasn't involved in the first legislation. That was even more challenging, because then what you had to do was that it was the creation of a neutral and harmonious working environment in huge big corporations. So that meant going in to places and stripping down symbols of religious and political identity. Now, my old friend Joe that used to work with us, now sadly departed, worked in Shorts aircraft factory, and he says that in July in Shorts it was walking down the Champs-Elysees. You're just getting hit up the face with Union Jacks. So that kind of stuff that people find that hard to understand that the workplace was like that, because that legislation has been very, very successful. But that's how difficult it was, and it was embedded in institutions. And I suppose one of the consequences of the conflict and the peace process is that a lot of those, particularly in employment, those issues have been redressed. And there's a sense, particularly we've noticed it in relation to evaluations of the post Good Friday Agreement situation here, is that Protestant Unionist loyalist people feel that they've lost out, whereas there's a sense of nationalist gain among the whole thing. So that sort of tells you the extent of the problem. That's without even going into all the other issues around housing and the allocation of housing, the gerrymandering of votes and all that sort of stuff that took place. Those were all institutional. We had to change the institutions.
Yeah, I guess, people these days, I guess, sometimes don't believe that kind of institutional change is possible. That they just kind of, like, as soon as you say, yeah, we need to change the structure of something, that they just kind of say, oh, well, you just want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and tear everything down, and kind of ignore successful movements to make the country fair. I just also want to clarify something I said there earlier. I just about when I was saying about people from minority backgrounds and whatnot being worse affected by COVID, like, people of lower incomes have just been worse affected by it, and I'm not being like discriminatory in saying that that's not the case. Like, people with smaller houses who work on the front line, who have got jobs that have been considered essential workers, like, they've all been worse affected by this. And I just want to make sure people don't think I'm avoiding that. I'm trying to say that's not the case.
There's also another issue there, of course, that a lot of the people who were considered to be essential workers previous to COVID were considered low skilled, performing menial tasks, and then all of a sudden, and those are the people who were the lowest paid, people that were working on precarious contracts, people who were more susceptible to abuse in the workplace, and then all of a sudden we were revering and clapping these people as essential workers, and we wondered at the time, how long will it be in the aftermath of COVID? Because I suppose there was sort of a hope, wasn't there, in June and July, that we'd seen the worst of it and it would go away. But all of those people would just revert to their status back again as performing menial tasks. And those kind of things were happening. But you can't get away from the class nature of that. I understand exactly what you're saying, that there is a class nature to exposure to COVID and the measures taken for dealing with it.
Yeah, it's a You might do you think that there will be any improvement in how we look at those kind of frontline workers? Because, like, as you rightly say, there's the immigration bill that was coming through was classing nearly all of the people that we were classing as essential workers as you say, low skilled, because they're earning less than £30,000 a year. Like, that's where they draw the bar for what should be highly skilled work. And I mean, either you got to drop the bar or pay these highly skilled people more, one or the other. But do you think that will lead to maybe unions demanding more from like public sector unions, or just people, frontline workers, demanding more because of the work that they've put in?
Well, I think that we did at the time. I think that unions were a number of unions have to be commended for some of the actions that they took to ensure safety in the workplace. But whenever things started to ease off and restrictions started to ease off, and everybody thought that we had successfully beaten the virus in the summer, we could see signs very, very quickly that that people were just reverting back to the way they were treated previous to COVID. For example, just before the COVID-19 onslaught, I mean, nurses here in Northern Ireland had to take industrial action to get pay parity with their colleagues in the National Health Service across the water. And then we had the clapping every Thursday. We had the posters and the publicity campaigns about these heroes. We had Colonel Tom walking around his garden, raising nearly 40 million for the NHS. And then the first time that MPs got to discuss and vote for nurses for pay rise for nurses, they decided not to do it. So it's superficial. I think that unions are probably seen during the COVID crisis something that they haven't seen for a very long time, and an understanding among workers that it's only through collective action that they make any gains. And certainly, I mean, we even in the local area where I live, there were a number of workplaces where workers walked off the job despite the unions, as opposed to, as a result of union activity, in order to keep themselves safe and alive. And when you're confronted with those choices, you don't wait around for industrial action ballots. And that could be the new world that we're moving into.
So you think maybe it could end up being more spontaneous even than previous strike action could have been?
Yeah, well, if you're confronted with being told that you're an essential worker, and you come into your workplace and you have to stand shoulder to shoulder with somebody in a meat factory, or somebody that's not wearing a mask, or you find that whenever you ask for personal protective equipment, you can't get it, you have to make stark choices, don't you, on behalf of you and your family. And I suppose we're all, whether it's personal decisions or government decisions, we're all making those judgments now between our lives and our livelihoods. And in the absence of leadership, people will do what's best for them.
Do you think any of that's partially due to the fact that it is so difficult to go on strike, especially for nurses and for frontline workers? Do you think that kind of spontaneity is because of the difficulty it is now to, I can't remember the exact quota, but you need like a stupidly high percentage of your union to vote for strike action before it's like acceptable?
Yeah, well, I mean, the notion that even union workers would go on strike is a very rare occurrence, even in the most organised of workplaces, because it's so difficult. And successive anti-union legislation during the 1980s, I think there were 18 pieces of legislation introduced by the Tory government that the new Labour government didn't repeal any of those. So they're all still on the statutes that constrain the trade union movement. So it's very, very difficult. And of course, workers are in the material circumstances of a lot of workers is much different than it was in the 1970s and the 1980s. More likely to have a mortgage, to be crippled with high personal debt. And the notion that you would walk off a job to use your economic power in the workplace, it's nearly been eroded. It's so difficult for workers to take strike action that it's such a rare occurrence. It doesn't happen. But when you're confronted with a life and death situation, that's why I'm saying these people weren't ringing a union office to ask to speak to an official to get some advice on it. People are saying, I'm walking off, you can do what you want. And in some senses, unions had to deal with that, and some of them dealt with it admirably. But it's extremely difficult for any worker to take that kind of industrial action anymore while staying within the limits of the law.
So just to sort of move towards wrapping up, like what work are you working on with what campaigns or work you doing with Trademark at the minute? Like, is there anything you want to sort of highlight, like in terms of maybe research work, anything that you're doing at the moment?
Well, I suppose since really the last economic collapse, in 2008, there's been a sort of a separation of that anti-sectarian work. I suppose with this maybe the successes of the peace process, that workplace interventions are not as numerous as they used to be. Our focus has shifted very much to looking at what happened in 2008 and why did working people and why did the organs of working people, organised labour, not foresee what was coming and with that financial crash, and how do we ensure that the next crash, which we're already in, um, that people didn't see that coming. Now, COVID caught everybody on the hop in the sense that, I mean, we were heading towards another crisis in capitalism whenever we were locked down. Uh, but they couldn't use the argument. Well, nobody's seen that coming, because we've been arguing now for the last 10 years that um, well, actually, you can. And if you look at economics in a political economy sense rather than pure economics, you can quite easily predict the future just by looking back at the past. So we've been engaged in a lot of that work over the last number of years, developing our political education arm, and we're also concerned about uh, the uh, the lack of action on climate change is a real concern for anybody that's got children and grandchildren. In my case, um, that we are um, sleepwalking into something that's going to make COVID-19 look like a tea party when we're facing, in possibly in my lifetime, food shortages because of climate change, water shortages. All of those things are issues for the working class. So we've been developing programs with marginalised communities, ex-combatants, political parties, workers, and anybody that'll talk to us around exploring economic alternatives going into the future. And we see that as a real sort of natural extension of our anti-sectarian work rather than something completely separate.
I mean, like one of the things that I've been noticing of late that seems to really be popping up is the when I've been talking to people about how we might transition and sort of make Northern Ireland greener and more carbon neutral, or however you want to define it. And a lot of people have like the idea of Northern Ireland becoming far more self-sufficient in terms of food production and in terms of energy production, like ideas that I keep coming across in like loads and loads of different places and organizations is actually quite encouraging that there's a body of people who have realized that like that is probably the most, I don't know, like it sounds very isolationist, but it's ultimately the thing that's gonna secure stability for the country in what's going to be an interesting sort of rest of the century.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're starting from a very low base in the sense that all our institutions, whether it's officials at local council level or people in the Stormont Assembly, are conditioned to look at the economy and to look at um, all of these issues that are facing us through the prism of 40 years of neoliberalism. They can't see anything, past that, or they can't look outside of those parameters and say, well, why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? And the neoliberalism doesn't provide the answers for us. The only strategy it has is shutting down the public sector and more privatization and more austerity. Uh, and even, I mean, Boris Johnson, apart from his issue on Brexit, his promise to the people was no more austerity, and that they recognised that the people that voted him in needed to get their head lifted from what had been imposed on them by Theresa May, Cameron, and of course the Labour government that preceded him. So COVID has thrown everything up in the air around that issue, but it's not going to delay climate change. If anything, it could exacerbate that thing. And really, we see our role now as sort of trying to get people to start talking about what the future is going to look like, and confronting these issues that we may have an opportunity to change. But that will, for us, it's, all the changes that you make to your individual lifestyle, you can recycle as much as you want. You can, refit your home to be as carbon neutral as possible. But unless we get governments and institutions and corporations to take the same kind of actions, we're like the finger in the dike. It doesn't make any difference.
Well, I mean, that feels like a good note to end things on. It's go out, confront. I think the general theme of your work is go out, confront the things that you don't want to confront, and it's pretty inspiring message. Confront the darkness, the chaos, the unknowns, the things that make us uncomfortable or sort of bubble under the surface, and hopefully we can do something better with them than just ignore those problems.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, I'm optimistic. Being a Manchester United supporter these days, you have to be optimistic, don't you?
A little bit, yeah. But Mel, it was a pleasure. Thanks very much.
No problem. You're welcome.
Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the links in the description below. Until next time, thanks for listening.